All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on day one of the Almond Conference, and also thank you to our sponsors, who are a big part of pulling off this great event. I'm excited to have you here today to talk about, we'll move on to our first slide, regenerative farming, which some might think of as a buzzword, but more and more I've come to think of it as something that a lot of us as farmers are already doing in our farms and in our fields, and there's also opportunity to do more and learn more how to do and stack those practices. I'm Danielle Veenstra. I lead up environmental stewardship at the Almond Board, spanning everything from research to communications. I'm also a third-generation almond farmer, so I'm interested in hearing what these guys have to say too. And before we start, new for the Almond Conference this year, there's a QR code on the screen. That's how we're doing Q&A. So we're doing a facilitated Q&A approach. Scan this QR code right now. This is how you will submit questions throughout. You'll see the QR code is also peppered through the presentations throughout. And also note that once you land on the screen, the very first box is where you submit your questions. There's a few more below it that are kind of session feedback, but for the purposes of submitting questions for the speakers, go ahead and just put that in the first one. You can press submit. We'd love if later on you gave us some feedback too, but for the purposes of getting your questions in, you really just have to fill out that first box. Once you've submitted a question once, you'll have an opportunity to submit more if you have them. My colleague, Michael Roots, is here at the front, and he's going to be going through those, organizing them, and helping make sure we can get to as many as we can. I did the Q&A in the last session, and there were 27 questions, which we did not get through all of them, but really appreciate the interest in the conversation. So before I kick it off and introduce our panelists, today in this session marks the launch, really, of a new analysis that we've done here at the Almond Board, looking at regenerative farming adoption in the almond industry. Back on the tables at the back of the room is a new fact sheet that we're launching here today that summarizes adoption of what we've defined as the top regenerative practices applicable to almonds that are going on right now in the industry using data from the CAS program, from California Almond Stewardship Platform. The key finding for it, Gabrielle's going to go into it in details, but we already have really surprisingly wide adoption of a lot of these practices, and I think opportunity to learn more and kind of evolve in that space. So Gabrielle will talk more about that in detail. We will have a full report about this, much more detail coming out in spring 2026, working with our partner Sure Harvest in analyzing this, so continue or expect more from us to come on this topic. So with that, I'm going to introduce my panelists who are going to guide us through the rest of the time. We have Gabriele Ludwig, who's with the Almond Board of California. She's our Director of Environmental Policy and has worked for many years in this space. And she's going to be, like I said, talking about the report and the findings in that. We have Tanya Gemperle Goncalves, who is both a PhD student at UC Davis working in the regenerative space, as well as she is an almond farmer as well. And then we have Silas Rossow, who is the president and CEO of California Ag Solutions, works a lot on the ground with farmers in implementing these type of practices, and he's also a farmer himself. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Gabrielle. Here's the QR code one more time if you want to grab that. And we'll pass it to our speakers and then have some time for Q&A at the end.
Well, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be here this afternoon. And I'm leaving the QR code for a moment because it takes a moment to get it. But just starting as to why are we talking about regenerative ag? What is it? What does it mean? I think first is sort of putting it into the larger sustainability conversation. You know, I've been around for a time. When I joined the Almond Board 20 years ago, sustainability was already part of the conversation, and that really, to me, is still the larger umbrella. And that includes economic viability, environmental health, as well as social equity, or sometimes the 3 Ps or 3 Es. Regenerative ag really started with a focus on soil health or soil quality, so a lot of those principles are around not disturbing the soil, keeping roots on it year-round, increasing the diversity of plants that are grown in that soil, keeping it covered in some way throughout the year, and then ideally integrating animals in the system, though for many specialty crops for food safety reasons, that's probably not the wisest thing to do. And that is not the same as organic. Organic, in its, traditionally is also very focused on soil health, but the organic world has limits what kinds of inputs you can and can't use within it. So that's really different from the...
Hosted by me, Tim Hamrich, and brought to you by the...
So just to give you that broadly. And then, what is regenerative ag? Good question. Okay. There are a lot of definitions floating out around there. When we did a little bit of a search, you could see all of these organizations in the upper right-hand corner that have some kind of regenerative ag program, definition, certification, some with organic, some with outcomes-based. But the main thing I would say is what I've been seeing happening is it's no longer just a soil-focused, it's become broader and in some ways is morphing into a version of sustainability. I was at or Danielle and I were at a meeting in May, the Sustainable Ag Initiative, and I don't think we heard the word sustainability the whole time. It was all regenerative ag, even though the name's group is Sustainable Ag Initiative. But again, so we were looking at, just to give you a sense of that for background, what did we do is, and then the other reason why we're talking about regenerative ag is it's where the consumers are. For whatever reason, sustainability, regenerative ag has caught on with consumers more than sustainability has. It resonates more. Even if it may, you as an individual grower sitting there going, what is this regenerative? I'm already working on these things, and that's part of the point of this presentation. But really looking at some of our key groups that use it, Kind is one of the largest users of almonds. They have a plan to source 100% of their almonds from regenerative orchards by 2030. Simple Mills, that does almond flours and other flours, is also really been focused on regenerative ag and encouraging that to happen as part of their program already for quite some time. General Mills, again, almonds is not a big part of their portfolio, but they are engaged in almonds in this space. They have a goal of 1 million acres of regeneratively farmed lands. That's not just for almonds, that's across all crops they work with. And Nestle is already giving accounting of how much of their farming operations are regenerative, how are they, So just to give you a sense that in our CPG world, in our big companies, this is part of the conversation. So what we decided to do was, we have the California Almond Stewardship Platform, or self-assessment. We have data now going back to about 2009 for the first assessments. So we decided to look at, okay, can we find some frameworks for regenerative ag that seemed relevant to almonds, analyze them for what are they focusing on, and then can we find the CASP practices that align with those. The 3 frameworks we decided to work with is, one is Regenerating Together, and that is part of this SAI, the Sustainable Ag Initiative platform. Part of the reason for that is it's a global platform. Europe uses it a fair bit. We have already benchmarked our self-assessment program to their sustainability program. Regen Score is in the process of developing a tree nut specific regenerative ag assessment system. And then California Department of Food and Agriculture, for government purposes, developed a framework for regenerative ag that we also included in this analysis, since that might affect what other agencies think about what almonds are doing. So then once we had that and done that analysis of, I should just go back, we kind of looked at, of every question, which of those 3 asked what, and what were they asking, and how could we group them. And then we looked at, okay, of the CASP questions, which ones could we align to that? And really, basically, in some cases, it was we had a question that directly aligned with it, and if you said yes, then that counted towards doing regenerative practices. In some cases, if you did yes to several practices, like the example here for soil organic management, if there was a yes to any of those questions, then that counted as a yes towards the organic, towards the regenerative practices. And then in some cases, you needed to, the orchard needed to have done 2 or 3 out of a suite of practices to count as a yes. So just to give you that. And then the other thing to realize is, on the data, some of the practices don't apply for every orchard. So in that case, the total number of orchards is actually smaller, but just to realize there's that too. Coming out of this, we identified that these practices fell in sort of 5 categories. These are names that we use. You'll see other names from other organizations because they made more sense to us. Like input efficiencies often cost something else, but that's really what we're talking about here. And we actually identified 24 key regenerative practices, but 4 of those practices aren't relevant for various reasons to almond growing. So commonly, since it's coming out of annual cropping systems, they'll talk about crop rotation, or they'll talk about adding perennial plants into your system. Well, neither one is quite relevant to almonds or perennial cropping system. And then, as I mentioned earlier, livestock integration is really not something that the Almond Board recommends for food safety reasons, though we do have data showing that it makes a big difference to soil quality. It just, we have a tension there in terms of which way to go, okay? So then we took those 20 questions and, as I say, compared them to CASP. And here's what we found. And really what the key message here is that almond growers are already doing a lot of these practices to some degree. This is not new, not novel, not new. It may have a new term, and there is a philosophy to go with it, I'll put it that way, about thinking how you think about your operation. But if we're just looking at the practices, over 75% of the orchards were implementing at least one of the practices out of each of those 5 categories. 8 of those practices are used by 90% or more of the orchards that are part of CASP, and 3 saw gains in the last 4 or 5 years, 5% gains or so in the last 4 or 5 years. Another way to analyze the data was just looking of those 20 practices, how many growers are doing how many of them, and what we see there is 80% of the orchards, and this is for 2024, reported using 11 or more of these practices. And examples of those practices include things like organic soil amendments, IPM, reduced passes, et cetera. So just to give you a sense, those were some of the key practices that were already being done by almond growers. And then the other thing, and again, coming back to part of the way regenerative ag is trying to get people to think, is to think more about the systems approach. And I'm not going to give my definition of regenerative ag. This is not an official Almond Board definition. It's like, how can you bring more biology back into the agronomic system to carry some of the load of farming? That's my definition. It's not going to carry all the load. I think there are a lot of people out there who seem to think it will. I doubt it, but can you bring more biology back in the system by feeding the soil, increasing plant diversity, et cetera, to help with that? So in terms of soil health or soil quality, one of the questions is to what extent are growers doing multiple of these practices together in a single orchard? And really what we're seeing here is the majority of growers, if they're doing a soil organic practice, they're putting in either compost or chipping their prunings and putting it back on the soil. If they are adding another organic matter practice, then they're typically doing compost with cover crops. So again, just to give you a sense of where the growers are right now. And I would say, for those of you who were in the session before this, we actually have a soil guide that just has come out that I think is actually really helpful to think about how do you work with the soil for a variety of reasons. That ties in with this, just with that. But with that, the other thing, and this comes back to what Danielle was just talking about, for us, it's not just taking the data, but then being able to use that information out in the outside world, okay? That can be helping our handlers deal with questions from buyers. That can be us being able to talk to about almond industry and what it's doing. So Danielle and I have been at various events over the last year, especially Danielle, where we've been able to talk about here's where almond growers are. And let me tell you, this is all Danielle's blood, sweat, and tears, okay? This is hot off the presses. So just to give an example, for soil health, we can say, look, 42% of the orchards are using cover crops. And it's more even split than I have to admit I expected between resident cover and planted cover, but just as an example of what we can talk about coming from this analysis. In the case of biodiversity, again, we've had some surprises here that, 98% of the orchards that have are next to a river or stream maintain some kind of riparian buffer, that a majority of the orchards have some kind of vegetation they maintain, whether it's hedgerows or others outside of the orchards, that 59% of the orchards provide pollinator habitat. Again, showing this is something that's already part of the almond growing culture, even if we don't call it that, regenerative ag. Water, it seems hard to believe that talking about that we have 88% micro-irrigation is still a relevant talking point, but it is, okay? Having that CASPS data and being able to talk about it is still relevant. And again, a surprise was how many growers have been doing recharge, given that it's a relatively new practice, and it's not easy to do, and you need the right conditions, both regulatory and water-wise, to do it. Input efficiencies, again, not that surprised, but 38% of almonds orchards use some solar power, 92% have, optimized the nutrient management. I will say, I'll give the Almond Board some credit for the research we funded and the outreach we've done on nitrogen management that's also gone into the Irrigated Lands program, but just to give a sense of how that data is being used. And the other one is community, and this gets back into that part of this conversation is about how does your farming impact the people who work for you as well as the neighbors around you. And really when we look here is the value provided by volunteering in your community, providing charitable giving, being on the school board, things like that, all contribute to improving the quality of life in your community. So getting credit for that in the way of through this communication and this assessment. So for those of you who have participated in the California Almond Self-Assessment Program, thank you, keep doing it. This allows us to be able to tell these stories about almond growing. So just that, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tanya, and if you have questions, get the QR code.
Thank you, Gabrielle. It's a perfect lead-in to my presentation, which will be focused on the current research and, current research in regenerative almond practices and then the agronomic benefits that we see from them. So I'm here today in my capacity as a PhD student in the Gaudon lab at UC Davis. But this is a newer hat for me. Usually I'm here at the conference sitting in the audience. As a grower, I farm almonds with my dad. Together we farm 1,800 acres in Stanislaus and Merced counties. And I have 13 years of experience, including implementing most of the practices that I'm going to talk about today. So as Gabrielle mentioned, a lot of these practices are already being implemented in orchards up and down the valley. But there's a range in what these orchards look like. And so some orchards might be implementing a single practice, and that could be, a mindset might be like a tool in the toolbox to help solve a challenge that you're facing. Some orchards, you might be using multiple practices and starting to stack them. And here you start to see synergies and the benefits start to stack up as well. I think of this more like a Swiss Army knife because you're getting more utility, more bang for your buck here. And some growers are like rethinking the system, kind of redesigning things with ecological principles in mind. And to me, that's like redesigning the blueprint. And instead of having tools for problems, you're redesigning the system so that hopefully these problems come up less in the first place. And I think that ties in well with Gabrielle's definition of like maybe the biology is doing more of the work for you. So today I'm going to start by digging into the research on single practices, but I want to make clear that there's still a lot of complexity and variability in implementation, even with just a single practice. So looking at single practices, I'm going to be looking at organic amendments, specifically compost and holes and shells, as well as orchard recycling and cover crops. And if we're thinking about tools in the toolbox and solving specific challenges, you can see that any of these practices can help with many of the challenges that we face as growers. Research comparing plots that had compost and holes and shells compared to unamended plots. And this is after a few years of applications. We are seeing lots of benefits. We're seeing nutrients being available to the trees. And so you should be applying these with the nitrogen and phosphorus numbers in mind and with management guidelines to make sure you're applying the correct amounts. And holes and shells in particular, we are seeing that they can provide 80% of the tree's needs of potassium. That was with an 8-ton per acre application. We're also seeing increases in soil carbon, and there's many associated benefits with the soil organic matter and the soil carbon. We're seeing more biological activity, and then there's a shift from bacterial-dominated communities to fungi-dominated communities. And then if you do leave the holes and shells on the surface, maybe in combination with off-ground harvest so that can stay year-round, we definitely are seeing like this mulch effect where you get lower evaporation and higher infiltration. For whole orchard recycling, they went back to the orchard 9 years after the replant, plots that were either recycled or burned. And again, seeing lots of benefits. I don't know that I'll name every single one, but basically greater water holding capacity, increased infiltration. I'll highlight lower tree water stress, and then I think a really significant one is the reduction in the nitrate leaching potential by 52%. Yeah, I think that's huge. And as far as trade-offs, we're not really seeing any yield trade-offs if you follow proper fertilization. And we're also not really seeing any diseases spreading or anything like that. The benefits with cover crops are more complex because depending on the species that you select and how you manage it, you can actually impact the benefits that you're going to see. So let's say you're focused maybe on this up arrow at the below ground benefits, so soil health benefits. You can choose species and then make management choices that will be focused on the roots that you're adding to the orchard. You can do the same thing with above ground benefits as well as pollinator benefits. And this graphic comes from the Cover Crop Best Management Practices Guide. And it goes into much more detail than I will right now, so I definitely recommend grabbing that. If this is interesting to you, you can get it downstairs at the Almond Board booth. Looking quickly at the cover crop below ground benefits, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, a lot of the same benefits, but again, increased water infiltration. And we do have research now showing that these cover crops are not necessarily using more water. So we're not really seeing that increase in ET in every case. We see, again, this labile, like mobile carbon and nitrogen, so that's the fertility being available, as well as soil structure improvements. The one that's been hard to pin down, and so we're digging into it more, is the soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. And so we have some research trying to look into what's going on in terms of long-term carbon storage. Looking at above ground benefits, I'll focus on pollinators. There's a study that showed that having cover crops or forage on the borders did lead to increased colony strength after bloom. And another study showed that having the forage there, there was no change in honeybee visitation to almond flowers. So the bees weren't getting distracted by the cover crop. Looking at navel orangeworm, we see that if you have cover crop in place when you do your winter sanitation, the study showed reduced spring emergence and egg deposition of the navel orangeworm. We think this is likely due to increased decomposition of the mummy nuts And it could also be related to increased microbial and natural enemy activity. So now that we've looked at single practice benefits, I'm going to get into research that was looking at stacked practices, multiple practices implemented together, and the benefits there. So a study by Krista Marshall, published this year, looked at 12 almond orchards, and they were on a management gradient, so orchards with different amounts of cover, and then different timing for when the cover was in the orchard, as well as different organic matter inputs and diversification, whether that was with the cover crops or with bringing graziers into the orchard. And this study focused mainly on soil health benefits, and they did find that the orchards with like all of the practices, the full stacking with animal integration, had the most positive outcomes. So these orchards had the lowest compaction, the most total soil carbon, and the highest nutrient cycling and availability. Another study by Tommy Finster, published in 2021. This study paired up orchards that were either conventional or regenerative, and it took a little bit broader scope, but it still found the regenerative orchards had higher soil health scores. And so these scores looked at a few biological and chemical soil properties and kind of combined them together. They also saw significantly faster infiltration, 6 times faster infiltration in the regenerative orchards, as well as higher microbial biomass, higher insect biomass, and diversity. And they also noted more earthworms. And the analysis says that this no one practice can be attributed to these outcomes, that it really was the stacking of all of these practices together that led to all of these benefits. So that brings me to the study that I'm working on with my PhD. This study is very similar in that it's also looking at orchards with different levels of stacked regenerative practices. We have 30 orchards from Chico to Merced, and these are commercial, mature producing orchards. This study also has a demonstration trial that was developed when the orchard was replanted. And the orchard was planted with plots that included whole orchard recycling and biochar treatment plots, as well as split plots of compost and cover crops. And so we've been going out to these orchards over the last 2 seasons. We have a lot of collaborators. So Rebecca Riles' lab at UC Merced collected soil samples and is analyzing those. Neil Williams' lab, an entomology lab at UC Davis, collected insect samples, and they did a pollination survey as well. The Sat Darshan Khalsa took leaf and fruit tissue samples and collected a harvest sample. And then we at the Gaudon lab looked at soil water dynamics, so infiltration and water holding capacity. And I'm also going to be doing the analysis that takes all of these results and looks at them all together. And we're getting the team set up right now that's going to perform the economics analysis. So we're excited to get that going. We're still processing samples and analyzing data. So this is, like I said, preliminary. And I think just a very small tip of the iceberg in terms of what this data is going to be able to give us. But to give you something, looking specifically at the soils here, we do see that the orchards with more stacked practices had lower bulk density, so meaning lower compaction. And there were significant increases in the soil carbon concentrations, almost 70% there, and nitrogen concentrations in the soil, almost 60% there, And those are concentrated in the top 10 centimeters of the soil. The top graph is showing active carbon, again, higher in the regenerative systems. And so the active carbon is the mobile carbon. This is the carbon that's going to be readily available for the microbiological community. There's more results in the poster. It should be up now. I'll be there tomorrow during the poster sessions, so feel free to come check that out if you want to learn more. I'm also going to highlight the research that's going to be keeping me busy for the next 2 seasons. And in this, we want to answer the question of, so do all of these benefits that we're talking about with these regenerative practices, like the increased infiltration, increased water holding capacity, lower tree water stress, does that translate to reduced irrigation needs? And so we're taking an orchard that has a history of rows with regenerative practices and rows without. In this case, the practices are whole and shell amendments and cover crops. And we're going to split those rows into 2 treatments of either full irrigation or deficit irrigation. And we're hoping to be able to answer, can we reduce irrigation without reducing yield because of these regenerative practices? So keep an eye out as we find out, hopefully, an interesting answer to that question. So some last thoughts. This has been focused mainly on the agronomic benefits, but there's, I think, economic implications and social implications as well. I won't get into a lot of the details there, but I think it's important to mention. And then I also wanted to highlight that there's some key enablers that will allow these practices to be more widely adopted. And so, yeah, I think these are all parts of the conversation, but maybe a little bit beyond the scope of this talk. And so I've been talking at you for 15 minutes, but I do want this to be a 2-way conversation. So please give me your thoughts, your feedback. What are we missing? I want this to be applicable to you. That's the whole point. And I want to know, what questions you're interested in. So feel free to give me email or come say hi at the poster. Or you can use the QR code. There might be a spot for a comment as opposed to a question. I'm interested in it all. And with that, there's so many thank yous for this that I just presented on many years of many people's hard work. There are a lot of collaborators. There are, a huge number of people working on all of these projects. Big thank you to the growers that invited us to their orchards, and big thank you to the teams on the ground that, are the only reason that this research happens. So thank you. And with that, I'll pass off to Silas.
Well, thank you. How are you guys doing this afternoon? Great. Are you guys excited for another presentation? Well, I always want a little bit of audience participation here. So one of the things I'll ask you guys to do is, those of you who are farmers or directly related to farming decisions, can I see your guys' hands raised? Okay, pretty good chunk. Now, another question is, who in here is related to the consulting or retail side directly to farmers? Okay, so I'm surprised there's a lot of farmers in here. So the conversation that we're going to have is really to you guys, both of you groups. Those of you who didn't raise your hands, it's not that I don't care about you, it's just this presentation isn't going to be really maybe as interesting to you as all the other pieces of information. So wanted to give you guys a little bit of my story, where I come from, the decisions that have been made in my past that have shaped my future and where I have continued to go. So grew up in Dos Palace. Those of you who know where that is, great. It's a small little town. But my main focus was always growing up in agriculture. I got to drive a tractor, I got to irrigate, I got to do a lot of the typical farm kid type things. Went off to school, came back, got to manage a very large farming operation where I had a lot of autonomy. I had the decision-making ability. But my main goal that all of my bosses had on me was, you need to be profitable. And that's a lot of what this conversation is going to be about. And that's really what shaped a lot of the decisions that I made on the farming management matrix that you can look at all these decisions, right? So one of the things that started my journey down this, I guess you could say the rabbit hole of regenerative, or, how do I improve the system that I'm in? I'm managing, at that time, it was about 15,000 acres, mostly all dairy crops, a little bit of tomatoes, sugar beets, and almonds. But one of the things that I saw was the amount of inputs that I had on this operation was staggering, right? So right out of college, getting the opportunity to manage this massive budget, I got to see a tremendous amount of dollars coming in, but also a lot going out. And there was years where we got to see a lot of revenue that didn't come back. We put a lot of money into different things. So I was always curious, how can I be more efficient, right? And that's the big push from all the owners of the operation, was how are you going to be more profitable next year? And one of the things was always, okay, well, I have a lot of tractor passes I'm doing. I've got a lot of labor. Am I really that efficient on this? So I was always asking questions. And one of the big aha moments for this journey was when I was driving through some of the fields. We were doing a lot of dirt work, getting ready to plant corn. And I saw this huge dirt devil, right? This massive dust tornado going through the field, and it was huge. It's one of those you guys could see for probably miles away. And I thought, that's most of the topsoil that I've worked hard, because all the fines that I was going, just kind of blown away. And then I saw it go into an alfalfa field, and all of a sudden, it stopped. The residue on top of that field kept it all together. And it's like, okay, I've heard people talk about this strip till or conservation tillage. I know it's all Midwest stuff. Could I put that into context, in my context here, where I'm doing, 8 to 12 tractor passes to get corn planted? So I was kind of curious with that, and so I figured, okay, well, let's make a change. Let's kind of figure out what solution could I come up with. And so I implemented a lot of the things that were done in other areas. I had a lot of people that I asked questions to, and asked a lot of them, what you did, what did you do that failed, and what would you do differently in the future? And one of the things, I had a lot of mentors that helped me through that process. And that's really what started this journey for me. Was I saw problems, and I knew there were solutions out there. I just had to talk to people to find out how I could get these things figured out. So that's really where this curiosity started, and really why I am an owner of a solutions-based business, right? I sell products, I sell solutions. I help people with problems create profitable solutions, right? I'm not just throwing things and hoping it sticks and it's profitable. These are things that have to be validated, and it's you guys who are the ones who are actually looking at these systems and these products, the different systems that we're researching here. But you guys are ultimately the ones that are trying to figure out, is it profitable, right? And that's the key thing that I recognize every single conversation I have with growers. It always comes down to, well, is it going to be profitable? And the answer has to be yes, right? True sustainability is just to maintain. But when we talk about regenerative, where my mind goes is we've got to regenerate your profitability in a lot of these contexts, right? Not greenwashing it, but actually making it to where these systems are profitable, not just too much feel-good stuff, right? So where I'm at now is I get to really work in these situations in a lot of different crops up and down California. And specifically, a lot of these conversations that we'll have today in this presentation will be almond focused. A lot of interesting things I've tried, and a lot of interesting things I've seen fail. And I've been a part of failures, and I've been a part of successes. I have learned more from every single failure that I've had in the field than I have all the successes that I've had. And I'm sure you guys as farmers know that very clearly, because it's a pain point, right? You don't want to lose money. You don't want to lose the family farm. You don't want to go backwards in something. So anything you're going to try, you want to make sure it's going to work. So I really work with mitigating risk. So are we going to try it on a small amount? And how do we scale that within the grower's operation? I have a lot of experience with that. So some of the 3 passions that have driven this, and really where not just the company, but I think all of you probably align with these statements, is I want to improve the ground that I'm farming, because I also farm almonds in the Madera area, and I want to see things get better every single year. I want to see profitability go up every single year, right? Some of these things are out of my control, but I do have a lot of control on my inputs and my practices. Now, stewardship. I think that's one of the things that I've been called to this earth. I am supposed to steward any resource that I'm given. How do I make things better and how do I make things help other people within the community that I have. Relationships is key, and that goes into development. I have 4 kids, and I want them to have the same opportunities in the Central Valley of California that I did growing up. I got to start siphon pipes that were too big for my hand. I got to drive tractors and hit telephone poles, right? Those are all the things I got to do as a kid that gave me great working experience as I grew up. I want my kids to have that same opportunity that I did. But for me to play a role and to make sure that California has profitable agriculture here in the Central Valley, I want to make sure I'm a part of that. And if we do nothing, like not implementing a lot of these innovative practices, we will watch California agriculture diminish. I don't want to be a part of that. I want to make it flourish. So that's a lot of what the development is. So real briefly, the top 3 things I've learned through failures and successes. Remember, I've learned more through failures than my successes. So you can ask me off stage all the different things that I've tried that have failed, and I will fill up your calendar with all of those. But I can also tell you what has been successful in different regions and what I would recommend doing. So the easy thing with this is maximize biodiversity. Think of the soil system as a network or a community, right? A city. The more people you have in that city with specialized traits, they're going to do a lot more different jobs. Like you have someone that's only focused on picking up trash. You have someone that's only focused on, education, or groups of people. If you're trying to do it all with one person, it's going to be very difficult, and you're not going to be able to scale that. The larger the community, the more diverse the microbial community, the more resilience your system is going to have. You're going to be able to use less miticides, you will use less fungicides, and you will have much less problems in the whole context of nutrient cycling. But that doesn't come very easily. There are going to be challenges. So going back to what is your motivation, like for my curiosity, I think that's a question each and every one of you guys have to ask, because you will fail. This will not be easy. You have to do these things in the right order. You have to figure things out yourself. And you know what? What I might have done in Northern California might not work for someone in Southern California, or even right across the street. You guys have to be willing to take a small portion of your ranch, experiment, play with these things, measure these things, and move forward, and then make a plan. And so those are things that you guys have to really evaluate, because you can trust the science, and I've no doubt science is very important. I'm a science person, I love that. But you guys also have to be able to implement things and be able to put it into context for your operation. And that's a difficult thing to do. That takes some time and effort and motivation. The other thing I look at is, so just kind of how we maximize that biodiversity is really looking at multiple species in a cover crop. And when I say multiple, I'm not saying 3, 4. I like to see 8 and above, because a lot of the meta research that is out there on soil microbiome and the diversity that it increases, more diversity of plant species really increases that. Now, we're still studying that in the almond realm, but a lot of these things still reign true because they're basic soil principles, basic science principles that are, when you increase diversity, you will increase resilience. That's just a simple fact that we see on every single crop that's been studied. And also the other interesting things, I'm a big cover crop component or a proponent for all these things. We have to be able to look at how we manage that. And I'll talk a little bit about that, because that is the point of failure or success, is how we manage that throughout the system. Also a big proponent of compost, adding other amendments into the soil, balancing your soil pH, increasing microbial diversity. Compost is huge, but you can overdo it. I have been a part of that as well. And I've also seen mediocre results with compost, but I've also seen some fantastic things that come with that. So there's a lot of interesting things around compost. And then biological additives. When I say that, remember, I'm also a retailer. I sell stuff, but I also recognize that there are certain things that we can really influence in the soil system. Sometimes you can do these things yourself. Create compost teas. There's some fantastic free resources, but they require work. You guys can make this on your own farm. So I'd encourage you guys to really investigate that. But remember, these things are going to take time. They're challenging, so don't just push the easy button and expect it to happen. Reducing disturbances. The reason why I asked who's a retailer, has influence on that, is we sometimes oversell certain products. We look at how do we get the grower to buy certain things. Now, there's a lot of good PCAs, a lot of really good consultants out there. But at the same time, I've recognized and I've seen growers with frustration of like, why am I putting this product on? What's the purpose of this? So when I challenge people to think about, what are you applying on your field, ask questions. Your consultant, PCA, CCA, anybody providing input into your operation should very well be able to articulate why that product, service, whatever it is going to help you. And if not, you need to question that. It is very important that we look at, testing all these things on our operations, because from my experience, and I know most of you, sometimes you guys have maybe not applied something or applied something and seen a huge difference. Like, wow, that was obvious. We need to be doing these little experiments all over the farm. Sometimes it's a fungicide. Sometimes it's insecticide. Sometimes it's just a fertilizer product. Are we over-fertilizing? Yeah, in a lot of situations. Are we under-fertilizing? Probably. But how are we ever going to know that if we're not measuring it ourselves and being able to understand? So that's something I'd encourage a lot of you to do. I'm not saying you hire a whole nother person to, be an audit division, but really pay attention to those little things. Remember, this is your guys' future, your profitability, and it takes effort to really understand what is going on here. And then also community. This is probably one of the most important things that I look at, is community is so important. We have to be able to help each other. I love events like this and other, different events where we get to talk, but one of the most important things that I see is when I see growers exchanging phone numbers and them asking each other questions outside of the group that we have brought together. That is so critical. That's important, because we're going to fail. And someone else has probably failed and done something that I'm probably thinking about doing, and I better ask around, because there's going to be someone willing to tell me, if you're going to do that, this is how you need to do that. I appreciate that, and that's kind of that mentor-mentee relationship. We've got to be able to have those. So I'm a big proponent of that. So I'm going to fly through a few of these other things, just cover crop planting strategies. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but one of the key things is doing it. How are you going to manage it? I would say each one of us has a different pain tolerance. Each one of us has different risks that we're willing to take. Some of us might only be willing to plant an 8 to 10 foot strip so we can mow it and manage it super easy. I have worked with some growers that love flying it on and then letting the rain put it on and then throwing the sheep out there and grazing it all over. I've seen that, been a part of that, and I've seen great successes, but I've also seen some major challenges that we didn't address. So how do we look at each one of these and make a plan going forward? And one of the biggest things that we don't have control over is the weather. Right? We all think it's like, I'm going to do this practice, I'm going to implement it, I'm going to get some great results, right? Well, inevitably, we have a March like 2022, and we get hardly no rain. And then all of a sudden, the year before, we're expecting those results. In March of 21, we had fantastic rain, right? That's the same cover crop blend, planted exactly around the same time, within, I think, 2 days of each other, historically speaking. And the picture was taken within a few days of each other on the same dates. So when we see successes and failures, a lot of it is outside of our control. Your termination plan for a cover crop is so important. This is where I have seen great successes and I have seen great failures all around this. You've got to be able to manage it and get on top of it so the weather doesn't push you behind. You can use simple things like a ring roller, breaking over the brassicas so they don't continue to go, and changing your carbon to nitrogen ratio in that cover crop. That's huge. Are you going to chemically terminate it? Mow it? What kind of mowing blades do you have on your mulcher, right? Or on your mower? If you're going to have a cupped blade or if you're going to have an L blade, how much diesel are you going to burn? I can tell you those little things, changing blades and the timing and the height of the mower, can save you guys a lot of money and save you a lot of time. So how you terminate is huge. And what I also often tell growers is you have to begin with the end in mind, right? Think about carbon to nitrogen ratio. Those of you who are used to buying compost, you're probably used to seeing a carbon to nitrogen ratio. Well, the cover crop itself has a tremendous amount of carbon in its biomass, but it also has some nitrogen. You have to manage that maturity in that cover crop to be able to understand how much carbon that biomass is and how much nitrogen it naturally has. Because if your nitrogen level is low in that cover crop, if it's reached a maturity, like if it's starting to produce seed, your C-N ratio is already way out of whack. If it's in the vegetative growth stage, your C-N ratio is a lot closer. So mowing it down, it's going to decompose naturally way faster, regardless of high cereals, brassicas, broadleafs, legumes, whatever it's in there. But once it starts to mature, your C-N ratio really goes out of whack. And if you don't have enough nitrogen in your system, the microbes in your soil, they'll help break it down. But guess what? They're going to be using the nitrogen that you have that's in the soil, that's from your fertilizer, to break it down before the tree can even get it. Because remember, microbes eat first. They kind of have a priority there. So how you manage your cover crop makes a huge difference on how you actually will have success or not. Reducing disturbances. That's another huge one. Try playing a little bit without doing something. Back off on fertilizer. Increase it. Always have a check. Always look at these kind of things. Too many passes. I'm guilty of that at certain times. I have either disked too many times, mowed too many times, but you have to find a balance. You have to measure that. I can't tell you a perfect formula because everybody's different. Just think of what are you doing that you're like, man, I'm really doing that a lot. I need to evaluate that. You have to measure these things. You can't just like feel like, it was pretty close. One of the most interesting things is disturbance. When I talk about measuring disturbances, this is a huge disturbance. Remember how hot it was last year? How hot that soil was? Imagine how much water is actually evaporating from the hot soil surface versus the covered. Now, it's a different management strategy there in almonds, but the amount of water that is kept in the system with a cover crop as a mulch is massive. I have seen growers completely change their irrigation strategy because of this idea. Yeah, it's some work to manage, but these are little things that growers are evaluating and saying, hey, it's worth my time and effort to manage like that. These are right next door to each other. Which soil temperature would you rather have? And I think one of the things, my biggest passion is community, right? If you're going to do some of these ideas and implement some of these things, you have got to have somebody who is willing to stand beside you and guide you through there. Here's a few different groups that I have seen that have been pretty effective. Of course, yes, I'm in there because I think I'm pretty effective at helping people with that. But I also look at you guys plugging in after these events, right? These are not the only event you guys need to be going to. Get people's phone numbers, ask them questions. I have seen growers really learn more from grower to grower than I could ever teach them, that they could ever learn at a setting like this, right? It's grower to grower is the most effective way to learn. Plus, you trust somebody who's doing it right next to you a lot quicker than someone trying to sell you something. I get that. So I think for all of you guys, we need to look at a continuous improvement process. These are things you guys need to have. Like if you want to implement these practices, you just need to go through this series. And if you need help, I can help you with that. But it's just a simple concept. If you guys are interested in contacting me, helping you through it, let me know. But there's a lot of opportunity. We just have to ask.
All right, thank you, Silas and Tanya and Gabriele. So we've got a good amount of time for Q&A, and for those of you who joined mid-session, we've been doing a moderated Q&A. This is the QR code here if you still have questions to submit and ask, but I'm gonna hand it over to my colleague Michael, who's moderating that, and is gonna ask some questions of our panelists.
Okay, we're gonna start with the questions. Some of them are connected. I'm gonna start with Gabriele. So, Did your review also identify gaps in CASP, which could be addressed by adding a small number of questions or edits to existing ones to enhance our ability to tell a regen story for the industry? Also, the other question was, what percentage of the industry uses biochar?
So just want to make sure I got the question. So updates to CASP and
the other question was percentage of the industry that uses biochar.
okay. So the short answer is yes. Working through this process, Danielle was keeping notes of how many questions we needed to add, and biochar is one of the questions, and actually the almond hulls usage is another one of the questions for the organic matter inputs. And it's going to come to you, Michael.
But But I will say also for CASP users, we're also conscious that we don't want CASP to be sprawling either. So we definitely had some learnings going through it and trying to make that right balance so we can have good data for you for storytelling, but also not make CASP too expansive.
Perfect. Another question regarding biochar. It needs to be incorporated into the soil. However, tilling it in is a soil disturbance. Is it okay to periodically disturb the soil?
I'll let Tanya actually do that because they have a lot of experience with compost where you have the similar question of, is it better to incorporate it or just leave it on the surface?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a question we ask ourselves all the time. So our almond acreage is like purely fertilized with compost, and it's kind of the same trade-off question because we do incorporate that trade-off, the compost, to make sure we're not volatilizing the nitrogen and it's staying in the system. And so I think I am still looking for the answer to that question personally. I don't know that we know definitively like the benefits of biochar outweigh the trade-offs of tillage. So I would say it probably is context specific, like when are you thinking about adding the biochar? How frequently are you thinking about? Is it like a one-time thing and then it's gonna be kind of no-till after that? And yeah, I think you can also, there's tillage is very, there's a lot of diversity within tillage and like how much you're disturbing the soil. That's also, yeah, you could probably incorporate it in a way where you're not disturbing the soil as much, or like it could be a pretty, like as part of an orchard redevelopment and you're like really digging in there and really turning the soil. So I don't have a definitive answer, and it might be kind of a case-by-case basis.
I'll kind of weigh in a little bit on the disturbance of the soil. I think one of the most important things that I've seen and recognized over the past is we've put a lot of compost out on fields, and as you get those soils healthier and healthier, the amount of earthworm activity that is actually consuming the compost is unbelievable. You will put on almost, half an inch, what it feels like a half an inch of compost on there, and it is almost gone by, late January, February. You will see all the worm casting. So I think, disturbing the soil for the reason of incorporating compost, I would probably not think that's a good idea. Now, if you have compaction issues that have been created or have major problems that you've done, or self-inflicted problems, then you may have to deal with that, right? Are you limiting your root growth because of what has been done? That's always a question to ask.
Okay, for hole and shell applications to an orchard, a question regarding broadcasting or applying to the berms, and how do you recommend that with a cover crop? Do you plant your cover crop first and then apply the holes and shells? Do you apply those first and then the cover crop?
Yeah, I think in some of the orchards that were in these studies and the orchard we're going to look at the coming seasons, I believe the hole and shell applications were to the berms, the tree rows, and the cover crops are going to be in the middles, the alleyways. But I think that's where you get to be creative, is how you kind of incorporate these practices and stack them in a way that works for your system. The hole and shells in the tree row were combined with off-ground harvest, so the holes and shells were left in place through the harvest. I don't know if that answers the question.
That actually leads into multiple questions, one specifically on, does your farm use off-ground harvest to accommodate the practices you've implemented? And a question just kind of asking, how does off-ground harvest play a role in a lot of these regenerative ag practices?
I think that's a game changer in terms of orchard floor management. We don't currently have in our personal operation, off-ground harvesting machine. It's definitely one of the next investments we plan to make. In the research, a lot of the orchards that were in that kind of regenerative end of the spectrum did use off-ground harvest, and I think one of my personal takeaways was that that really did kind of facilitate the adoption of these practices, especially bringing them into the tree row.
Yeah, I have quite a bit of experience with a few growers that have implemented off-ground harvesting, and it can be a challenge, and there can be some good wins. I think one of the interesting things that I've seen is most of you guys who are used to harvesting, you always have windfall, right? And there are certain varieties that just drop like crazy, and other ones you have to shake the heck out of it to get anything off of it. Timing is everything, so off-ground harvesting is, I think, got a great future. We just have to do a better job of understanding and how do we manage windfall, which might not be something we can actually do. It's just varietal. But to implement these practices, it is massively important. And I think that's probably where most of our water use efficiency will be coming from in the future, is being able to have mulches, cover crop that can be left on the soil surface, reducing soil temperature, changing the evapotranspiration rate in the orchards. There's a lot of potential there, but we have to really manage that and figure it out. There's a lot more to do.
And just a reminder, the Almond Board has funded research both on assessing the opportunities for off-ground harvesting as well as alternative drying, whether that's what we call semi-off-ground, where you still put it, you catch it in a catch frame, but still put it in a windrow, but you don't have to do the sweeping step, or whether you move it off-site to dry. But just remember, that's the other aspect to off-ground harvesting, is how do we dry the nuts? I always like to say we use natural solar power to dry our nuts. What are we going to do instead?
Okay, we're going to switch gears to whole orchard recycling. So if leaching is reduced in a whole orchard recycled block, can you make the assumption that you are getting greater nitrogen efficiency and can reduce nitrogen applications from standard recommendations?
So that again is going to be context dependent, because the leaching would occur kind of in the winter if you have these big rains. So in that case, maybe you're not losing nitrogen in the winter. I believe the recommendations after whole orchard incorporation are that you need to increase nitrogen applications, at least for the first few years, because that woody biomass is kind of locking up a lot of the nitrogen. So I think in the short term, no, and then maybe like long term is where you can see that nitrogen kind of cycling and staying in the system instead of being lost.
I would just add, I think this is one of the big question marks about, a lot of these soil health practices. There's a lot of claims about it reducing water use or reducing nitrogen use, and having the actual data that you can do that is not there. I mean, just between sessions, May Cullenber's here in the audit, sorry, we were talking about that currently the research shows that you can get increased yield or because you have better water holding capacity, but we don't have the data saying you can reduce the amount of water use and get the same amount of yield, to be very simplistic about it. And the same question is for nitrogen. So the assumption is, yes, you should be looking at your soil and looking at what's being contributed by the nitrogen and when is that nitrogen available. That's one of the big question marks. But I'll be upfront with you, right now we don't have good data, and as someone who also works in the regulatory space, this is a whole big question mark of how are these soil health practices going to be accounted for in the irrigated lands program, both from a growing perspective as well as from a leaching modeling perspective. So just a reminder, there's that aspect too. And I don't know if May, if you wanted to add anything. So I'm not sure everybody could hear, but I'll try and summarize. The gist of it, they've done a nitrogen rate trial and so far not really seen big impacts that it made a big difference or you could reduce nitrogen with whole orchard recycling. At the same time, the data shows, particularly in the first year, there's an increase in total nitrogen available in the soil quite quickly. But it's a little hard to assess how much of that nitrogen is actually plant available. So the bottom line is the question's still there. But again, coming back to Silas's point, I think this is the kind of thing where testing that on a small level, to the extent you can manipulate your irrigation system, is one of those things to maybe be able to test and see, does it make a difference? Can you maintain the yields and back off a bit on your nitrogen without hurting your yields?
Question, do resident winter cover crops still have soil improvement benefits?
Yeah, so there is a trial that looks at different cover crop mixes along with resident vegetation. It hasn't really been published yet, so I didn't really present on it, and we don't have like full results yet. But I would say, based on that, there definitely are benefits from just having your resident vegetation growing in the orchards. Depending on what benefits you're looking at, what you're thinking about, it may not be to the extent that a multi-species cover crop could provide, but in terms of like from bare soil to just having resident veg, like the resident veg is way closer to the cover crop than it, and the bare soil is like way down here in terms of like positive benefits.
Yep. I think one of the experiences that we've had and what we've recognized is there's been some really good research and data, not in the almond blocks, but in California, where comparing multi-species cover crops to native species, there's about a 3x root volume increase. So multi-species have about 3 times the soil volume interception, 3 times the root mass than just native species. And if you really think about what a cover crop is doing with all the root exudates, all the carbon that they're pumping back into the soil, I want as much root mass from that cover crop going back into the soil as possible. So the multi-species really improve that, but it's also how you manage that cover crop. If you're terminating really early, there's not a whole lot of carbohydrates being pumped back into the soil, so you're minimizing that. But also if you go too late, you're changing a whole different dynamic. So yeah, multi-species is where there's a lot more opportunity.
A question on, has anyone looked at increased bird diversity in orchards, particularly insectivorous species from hedgerows, providing overwintering NOW control?
The Almond Board's funding some research, and there should be a poster on it to go downstairs.
I think that this would be a good question. It's a little multi-pronged, but it might be good to close us out. So water and input efficiency have obvious ROIs for growers. How do we measure credibly and consistently other regenerative outcomes like biodiversity and soil health so they can also translate into economic value? The other part of that question also talks about research on the quality of almonds that are farmed regenerative.
I'll take a first stab at that. So a couple things. In terms of measurement, I think for organic matter, there's a lot of tools been coming on the market just in the last 5 years. May, in her presentation, talked about some of those tools, and I think that's also part of the soil guide that the Almond Board put out. Where we have struggled is figuring out how to get some of the economic value. So I'm trying to figure out how to be succinct here. If we look at the larger space, many food companies, when they start looking at their carbon footprints, and reminder, California requires large companies to do that, Europe is requiring large enough companies to do that, and if you supply into those chains, you will be asked for data. The almond industry will be asked for data. Really what we're seeing is that it's been hard to get good enough data for our system to meet some of the requirements for those people that do carbon markets in a general sense, not offset markets like ARB does, but voluntary markets. There are carbon markets out there, but they're basically based on generalized data. They're not necessarily almond specific or Mediterranean tree crop irrigated system specific data. So that's something we've been trying to work on and figure out. But I would also, I'm now going to editorialize, so please take it with that grain of salt. And this is probably really more for almond handlers, if any of them should be in the room. When an outside company, a buyer comes along and says, I want to buy regenerative ag almonds, or I want to buy almonds that do something to reduce the carbon footprint or reduce the water footprint, that's providing value into the supply chain. We need to figure out how do we say, yes, we'll do that, but only if some money comes back to growers. Doesn't have to cover everything, but some money. And to be honest with you, that is a real fundamental change I've been seeing in the sustainability space, is the big companies are starting to put some dollars in. I'm not saying big dollars, I'm not saying that, but whether it's in the almond industry, we've seen some companies put incentives in for growers to do certain things like bee-friendly farming or some things around carbon. But also, again, some of the sustainability meetings that Danielle and I have been at recently, where I've seen the supply chain try to figure out how do we collectively each of us put dollars in that reaches the growers to help them do practices that we want to see in the field. And actually at a meeting just 3 weeks ago, I had Kellanova, PepsiCo, and Nestle Pet Food saying, hey, we all use corn products, but I use the fructose corn syrup, I use the starch, and I use the oils. Why should each of us pay individually for the corn grower to do this? Can we collectively put some money on the table? Because we're all using something from it. So I just want to say, I do feel like that conversation is changing a bit. I don't want to say big change, but it's changing a bit because, again, if the industry, if the food companies want to get credit for some things that the growers have done in the field that will benefit them, then how do we figure out, and then I should also say the next complexity is how do we have data that has quality and can go from a grower to the handler to whoever's buying it. There's going to be those questions as well to be addressed. So it's a very complicated question. Sorry. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
Oh yeah, no, being a farmer, yeah, I would love to be paid a premium for what I'm doing. So when we look at, I think there's a lot of people in here, we've all gotten some form of like healthy soils grant, like I appreciate all those things, but I think from a more motivating perspective from a grower, it needs to be where I'm getting a 3, 5, 10 cent premium to be able to do these things. So if handlers, processors are paying that to us, that would be so much more motivating long-term because we're truly training the customer at the end of what is going to be healthier. But that's really the consumer packaged goods. Their responsibility is they are directly related to that. We have the story as growers of why we're doing it, what we're doing it. And our motivation has got to be right because I want to make sure that, I'm taking care of my farm so that my kids have the opportunity. That's a fantastic story for a consumer packaged goods to be able to tell and then be able to give me the premium for all the extra work that I'm doing because a lot of these practices are a lot more work, not necessarily financially more, but it's going to take another management level to be able to do that. So I want to make sure that I'm compensated for that because I know I'm doing the right thing, not just on taking care of these resources, but also I can be more profitable, but it is a lot of work to do that. So.
I love that you guys tackled the premium part of the question because that one's really, I think this whole question is really complex, really important. I think I'll try the reduced cost side as well because, and I'm talking as a grower here because I don't want to be considered an economist. But I think some of the benefits are really hard to quantify, right? If you're talking about increased microbiological activity, how do you put an economic number on that? I don't know that we can right now. But in terms of like, if we're making a decision and the choice is, should I spray herbicide trunk to trunk? Herbicides are expensive. And if instead maybe I'm reducing my spray row to like 5 feet, maybe you have to invest in a mower if you don't have one. But like our mindset is we really want to decrease our herbicide strip as much as possible, and that's purely from a cost-saving perspective. And if we're going to mow, we want that overlap to be as small as possible because otherwise we're paying twice. We're paying to mow it and we're paying to spray it. Just one example of something where you can kind of start to see the economic cost benefit play out. you'd have to go through each of those decisions and see what makes sense for you. And I think the second part of the question was the quality of the almond. I don't know that we know that answer right now, but I will point out that in my PhD project with the 30 orchards, we did collect harvest samples of all of the orchards, and so those are sitting right now. Like, we don't it's out of scope a little bit, so we don't right now have the funding to analyze those, but as part of our grand scheme is we collected them because we had the opportunity, and we do plan to do like a nutrient analysis as the opportunity arises to kind of answer that question of, do these practices then impact the quality? I'm thinking of like nutritional density, but also if you're talking about quality, like reject percent, things like that, that's also something we want to look at.
All right, great questions. And I'm actually going to add one thing on the biodiversity piece. It's something that we, as the almond board, are looking at how we measure. So if this is something you are interested in, it's a discussion that we're having actively at the environmental stewardship work group level, which helps to guide the almond board's investment in this space. There's a lot of existing measurements out there already, some of them that are based on just like pesticide toxicity versus there's direct counts. We're looking to fund some broader research in this space as the almond board. We have the songbird study and a few other things, but we want to have a more holistic look to support the industry and storytelling and get at some of the ROI stuff. So if that's a conversation you're interested in joining in, come talk to us after the session. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us here. As a reminder, we have the start of the session, the new analysis and fact sheet is at the back of the room. It'll be down at the booth after this session. And then after this is the general session, State of the Industry, right next door, which starts at 2 o'clock. So join me in giving our panelists one final thank you.